So last week, it was all about return and identity, and I'm summarizing a little bit, a couple of the issues, because should any of your population jump into this experience in the second week, we didn't tape the first week, what did we do that first week? We talked a lot about return, about the identity issues that Naomi and Ruth are representing at the beginning of the book. I mentioned that the root for the word return is used 12 times in that initial chapter. We discussed motives. We discussed relationships, right? How does Naomi feel about this Moabitess who is making this profession of love? Why does she seem to kind of ignore what Ruth says or just not say anything in response? And then when they get to the town, why is it that she basically goes on and on about how empty she is with a daughter-in-law who has just pled her life, her heart, her soul to her, right? Those were some of the questions we asked. We asked why it is that Ruth in this book is emphasized so frequently as being a Moabitess, right? Why that keeps getting pushed on us, right? Why not just the daughter-in-law of Naomi? Why stress the fact that she's a Moabitess? When we recall the issues of what Moabites mean for the Israelite community, descended from that incestuous relationship between Lot and daughters, right, who get their father drunk and then both get pregnant thinking there are no other human beings in the world and they have to do this in order to ensure the viability of humanity, and they sire that way, or he sires that way, the Ammonites and the Moabites. Child Ammon and child Moab are then the eponymous forefathers of those peoples. And we spoke about that kind of reputation, the reputation of the Moabites for having seduced the Israelites at Baal Peor. So what does Ruth represent? You know, somewhat other, maybe somewhat sexual, someone who belongs to that enemy territory, and how even do townspeople feel about Naomi, who's run away when everybody was facing famine with her husband, and then comes back and seems to be asking for their sympathy, seems to be asking them to understand her grief. And we also tried to speak a little bit with understanding and compassion about what it is to lose your entire family. That's what's happened to Naomi. Both Ruth and Naomi are widows. And we spoke a little bit about the way the townspeople greet them and say, oh, you know, they're kind of in a turmoil there. They greet them, and then what do? Nothing, as far as we can tell, to take care of the widow. And we all know that it's said over and over in Bible, take care of the widow and the orphan and the poor, and the stranger among you. 36 times, the stranger among you, because you were strangers in Egypt. So today's session is going to be about, from whence cometh my help. You know that phrase, right? S-I-A-N-I, right? That psalm. And also the dangers of the dark. We're going to be looking at chapter 2 and chapter 3. And there are some things in the Hebrew that I'm going to emphasize to you that I want to tell you are happening that might completely turn this story on its head in ways that you might find unexpected. So is everybody buckled in? Good. So in Ruth 2:3, right, and this is on your handout, I first want to point out that the English tells us, as luck would have it, it's the piece of land belonging to Boaz. Keeping in mind that Boaz is a pretty wealthy dude, powerful in his community, my question to you first is, where has he been when Naomi, his husband's, his relative's wife, when she returns, no problem, come on. You could sit on this side too. That would have, go that way. This would have been much less intrusive. You could have just like crept over here. I'm going to fill that front row no matter what. The next person, if there are 4 people coming in, they're all sitting on that chair. It's nice to meet you. Who are you, by the way?
Shelley.
And?
Mr. Shelley.
Eddie.
Eddie, my husband says that kind of thing all the time. So here we are in this place where this rich relative, Naomi comes back. And where's he been? Where's Boaz been in this story? What's it take to get him into the story? What does the text tell us it takes to get Boaz into this story?
He has the land.
He has land, right? And what has to happen for him to even show up?
Ruth has to.
Ruth has to show up at his land by accident, right? Lucky chance. Boaz has not heard about Naomi and Ruth in such a way, apparently, to move him to do a darn thing for them. It's not until after Ruth shows up at his land and he asks, you know, who's the young woman over there, that we get Boaz's action in the story. So it all hinges on Ruth happening to work on his land. Now the Hebrew there, which is like those super big letters in that line, and it says, Vayikar mikreha, which you all know what that means. It's a really interesting construction where in Hebrew you take a verb and you basically use it in one form and then you use it in another to make it really, really powerful. It's a kind of way of saying he surely did, right? He surely spoke. When you repeat the word, he spoke spokingly, right? Something like that is the kind of construction that you're seeing here. So it's an emphasis construction. And the word here, an ikar, what is an ikar? That is a happenstance, a thing that can just appear, can happen. But in this case, the Hebrew is actually saying to you, luck was happening, fortune was happening, a really happy happenstance was happening. And the only other time we get the word mikreha, the only other time, is when Abraham's servant Eliezer is standing at the well and says, makes a prayer to God, a servant, right? A servant prays to God, makes the first prayer in the Bible to actually ask for something specific. Go and look at the role of servant prayer and servant connectivity, the foreign connectivity, Hagar, speaking to God and saying, you've seen me and I see you. Right? Those are important moments. And he says, please let there be a happenstance. Let there be the right moment so that the right girl shows up at the well who is meant for my master's son, Isaac. So he prays for something like this to happen, which might tell us that the text, because all these writers know each other's work, the author of this text is kind of implying that there might be a little bit of divine movement going on here, right? That this happy happenstance might be in some ways influenced by divine favor. Nobody can be sure, but it's one interpretation. So happy happenstance, she lands right in the right place, and there she is on that field. And what do we know of her? What do we find out about her? What did you read and discover about Ruth and about Boaz and about the foreman when you looked at chapter 2? So, your turn. Some of it's on this page, but...
First, she's a Moabite.
Yes. It's not enough to say she's a Moabite girl. She's a Moabite girl who came from Moab. There's no reason to say the same thing twice. Is there? Or is there? What do you think? Is there a reason for that foreman, that supervisor, not just to say she's Naomi's daughter-in-law, a Moabitess, but she's a Moabitess who came from Moab and happens to be Naomi's daughter-in-law? What are your reactions and thoughts about the reason to emphasize this, to point it out twice to Boaz?
Maybe because she had the option to go back. She could have gone back.
Okay.
She's a Moabite by birth from Moab, so she could have gone back.
So you're thinking maybe that supervisor, that foreman, has in his head, she's a foreigner.
And she's a foreigner who chose to stay a foreigner.
Okay. All right. So maybe that's a positive thing that he's doing there, right? I'm really emphasizing to you how foreign she is, and she's still here, and this is what she's doing in the field. How about other reactions, readings?
I can't help but wonder, I mean, it's a surprise that she chose to stay. Is it in part because her kind is not wanted by most?
You know, honestly, if you just look at Israelite-Moabite relations, both in terms of text and in terms of what we really know about the history, you don't imagine these peoples getting along very well. Okay, I mentioned last week the Mesha Stele, which is written by the king Mesha of Moab after he trounces the Israelites, and it's a pretty violent text. You know, I wiped them out, right? And there are other examples, certainly from Bible, as I mentioned before. The Moabites are the ones who seduced the Israelites at Baal Peor. We have a Deuteronomic text, you shall not have a Moabite in your congregation ever. There will never be a Moabite accepted into your congregation. So there's a pretty intense boundary around those Moabites are dangerous. And who are the Moabites who seduced the Israelites, men or women? So I think there's just as much a reading of emphasizing her Moabiteness.
It's a warning.
Could be a warning. Could be a, look how, despite she's a Moabite, she's here and she's staying with us, and that's a good thing. Could be a warning. You see how you've got two completely legitimate interpretations here. They're both legitimate. How many of you have seen Fiddler on the Roof? Your generation has done that. When I ask my students, they don't know what I'm talking about. But you remember Tevye on the one hand, on the other hand. There's a joke. It's so old, I'm sure you've heard it. 2 Jews, 3 opinions. Right? But we've already had 2 completely legitimate readings of the use of this word and the stress on Ruth as a Moabitess. Any other readings you want to add? Yes, ma'am.
Well, one of my questions about the whole, why did Boaz not know? And it's because of the women. I mean, I think when Naomi and Ruth came back to Bethlehem, who's going to be talking about Naomi and Ruth? The women. They don't have any men. Boaz doesn't have a wife. So how would he know about the talk of the women, about these 2 people who are poor? And he just happens to be on his field looking at the reapers that he's hired and goes, well, who's that? The first line of 2 made me wonder if Ruth didn't know about Boaz, because she kind of picked his field and says, let me go in behind someone in whose sight I may find favor.
Right.
So I think it's the difference between Boaz. He was a sitting duck.
This is an interpretation I would just totally bankroll, except that Boaz says, I've heard about you.
Yes.
However, you know, the fact that he might have heard about her, but not with enough detail to make him concerned, I mean, you know, okay, we can excuse Boaz there. We can also, as I wrote in a blog post that I just put up yesterday, ask what it takes to get Boaz to really act. If we look at this step after step after step, right? At the end of chapter 2, things look pretty good. Boaz has given Ruth an awful lot of grain. She goes home, she can feed her mother-in-law. She actually tells a white lie at the end of that chapter. Did any of you notice? At the end of chapter 2, that part is not on your text. I'm relying on you having prepared for class. Right? She tells Naomi, oh, and Boaz said, you won't go empty-handed to your mother-in-law. Did Boaz ever say anything like that? No, he did not. It's a very interesting moment. I think one interpretation of that, how do you interpret that white lie that she tells Naomi, Boaz cares about you, when there's no evidence that Boaz has said anything of the sort? How do you interpret that comment from Ruth? You can interpret it generously if you'd like. White lies aren't always meant in a mean way.
Maybe she just didn't want Naomi to think she'd stolen it or she'd done something wrong to get it.
Interesting, right? That's interesting. Maybe she doesn't want Naomi to feel that she's either stolen that grain or done something wrong to get it, i.e., I did the right thing, I was given this, there's abundant grain, way more than she should have been able to gather in one day using the usual means, because Boaz even says, throw stuff down so she can pick it up easily. Gleaners are not usually given that kind of advantage. So maybe she's protecting herself. I didn't do anything wrong, Mom. Boaz gave this to me and said, don't go home to your mother-in-law hungry and not have food for her. Yeah, I really want you to think about this in light of, and I'll be right with you, in light of how immigrant populations who are feeling vulnerable about people thinking they're doing something wrong might be saying or managing how people respond to them because they are afraid and conscious that they are foreign and therefore going to be seen differently. So I really want you to hold that thought, because you've just described some of the behaviors that we could expect from people who are frightened and who feel the need to explain themselves. Okay, you had another thing you wanted to say about this.
Well, and maybe there's a juxtaposition of Naomi's physical needs that Ruth is helping to address by working, but also maybe there's this desire, this effort to ameliorate some of the grief she's experiencing by connecting her back to her family. Somebody actually does care.
She's building a bridge when you say somebody does care, Mom, right? Yeah, that, I can totally float with that. Absolutely. Her mother-in-law has lost not only her husband, but her children. Ruth has basically said, I will be your adopted daughter. Ruth, this white lie, I think, is one of the greatest acts of chesed, of grace, in this whole story, right? Because chesed, loving kindness, is a way to say, Mom, you're not alone. He didn't just give this grain to me because I'm young and decently looking. You are cared for, even though you have been in so much pain, you are not alone. Because those people who suffer that kind of grief naturally are among the most isolated among us. They withdraw, they get quiet, they don't eat. You have all known somebody who's grieving. You've all known somebody who's mourning. Now imagine that somebody losing both spouse and children. How they even survive from day to day is worth questioning. Yes.
Has Boaz read Deuteronomy?
Uh-huh. Has Boaz read Deuteronomy? Well, let me put on the historian hat since I forgot my rabbi hat. The historian in me will say that none of these characters, we don't have proof that any of these characters existed in real time, in real space, until we start coming to, sort of the period of David. But would Boaz have known the law and the traditions? I think, yeah, you would have known those things. If only because when we get to next week, we're going to discuss how, with great cleverness and amazing skill, it is Boaz who helps make a rewrite of Jewish law, of Israelite law, possible for an entire community. So would he have known that the Moabitess is coming from a hated enemy? Yes. Absolutely. Absolutely. In fact, most any Israelite would have. Okay, yes, sir.
Is there anything to this, what he calls her? Listen, Boaz says to her, listen to me, daughter.
Yes.
That's bold for this
Yes.
foreigner.
He calls her my daughter, right? Remember, Naomi has done that too. You kind of anticipated something from me. So first of all, I want everybody to hold the fact that Boaz is probably about Naomi's age, right? He's of her generation. Ruth is young enough to seem like a daughter to him, and he uses that phrase. If Boaz was a young, strapping 28-year-old, I doubt he would have said my daughter to Ruth. And in fact, for those who can read the Hebrew, you'll find that the author was so clever that the author created a kind of sort of gentlemanly language for Boaz that comes from an older time of Hebrew, and Ruth speaking a somewhat newer kind of Hebrew. So the author emphasizes the generational differences. It's sort of as if, Boaz said thee and thou, right? That kind of thing. So let's hold that. Why does he call her my daughter? What do you think that means? How would you interpret it? Yeah, go ahead.
You're accepted, you're welcome here.
Okay, you're accepted and you're welcome here. Notice he also makes a great point of make sure that you work with my girls, my female servants, and you stay away from and he's going to warn the male servants, don't molest her. Why does he have to warn the male servants not to molest Ruth?
She's a foreigner.
She's a foreigner.
And she's poor.
And she's poor. Very good. She's a foreigner and she's poor. What else?
No status.
She has no status.
Female.
She's female. Thank you, Emmy. If she were male, would he have to do this?
Unmarried, therefore no protector, no father.
Right.
She's an unprotected target.
Yes, absolutely. On every single level, she's an unprotected target. Do you remember the statistic I gave you last week? 80%. 80% of human trafficking happens with which group? Anyone remember? Which groups are 80% of human trafficking?
Women and children.
Think again. Think in terms of gender. Think in terms of age.
Women and children.
Women and children. Who said it? Yes, women and children are 80% of the people who are in human traffic conditions. How about sex slavery? You don't even need to answer that question, right? You know. So Ruth, in that age, is taking a position that is not different from women and children in our own age. She is the foreigner. She is the one who is helpless. She has no protection. If they want to molest her as a foreigner, they can probably do so with impunity. Can they shove her in a car and not protect her head? This stuff is real. What's in this book is right now. It's not 2,500 years ago. It's right now. So if you think about Boaz's relationship to her, he's setting up this my daughter, right? He says, I've heard about you. I know what you've done for your mother-in-law. And he uses some very interesting words there. He blesses her. He says, you've come out of your land. You know, he's recalling the Abraham moment where God says, go forth. Right? And he says to Ruth, you've left your mother and your father. I've heard about the fact that you came here and that you're caring for your mother-in-law. I know about this. He calls her, you know, some really important, he states publicly something about a foreigner and a minority. Who do you think he's talking to? Ruth? Or is there another audience for what he's saying?
His own community.
His own community. He now is building a bridge for her. He's responding by saying, look at this young woman who worked all day and hardly ever rested, and look at her virtues and her values. Now, am I particularly happy that it takes a rich, well-appointed, powerful man to make the foreign, helpless, female, unprotected, potential, molested girl or young woman have a good reputation? No, I am not. Because you would think that the townspeople had heard exactly what Boaz had heard. It's gone around what Ruth has done. Why is he having to protect her? Why should he have to protect her? Her reputation has preceded her, and it's still not enough. Do you see what I'm saying? Did you have something there?
Well, I was just going to say, but in that sense, her foreignness is not the only thing that makes her vulnerable.
Traded, sold, bought, right?
No. That's our impression of women in Hebrew Bible, and it is hugely overstated, and I think it's overstated. Frankly, I'm going to say something that's a little edgy here, so everybody breathe deeply. Okay? It's because you're seeing Hebrew Bible through the lens of New Testament texts, where there is much more around women being silent, women being subservient, women being controlled because the man is the head, right? You know all those texts I'm talking about, right? In Hebrew Bible, women are definitely not taking the same kind of constant positions of power that men do, but the stories change and alter the hierarchies. When Sarah is talking to Hagar, Sarah has full control over what's going on in the family dynamics there. It's Sarah who decides to give Hagar to Abraham, not Abraham who says, I'm going to use Hagar to sire a child. When the Shunammite says to her husband, I don't care what you think, I'm going to talk to the prophet, and I'm going to get the prophet to act on behalf of our child, she does so with full independence. She leaves town with full independence and comes back and negotiates with a king to get her land back with full independence. I could give you story after story after story. Abigail, the wise woman, the necromancer, on and on, where women are positioned in places of real power. The women of real ancient Israelite were mourners and professional ones, professional lamenters. They had positions as professional prophets. They had look at Huldah. Who actually sanctions that scroll that's found in the temple in the story of Josiah? They take it to a female prophetess and she says it's legit. So the idea that women are just bought and sold is a wholly overplayed idea. Do men control female sexuality in significant ways? Not total, but significant ways? Yes. Are there protections for women in Hebrew Bible? Some. It's a little bit more mixed up. And if you ever want, I'll come back and do 3 weeks on women in Hebrew Bible.
Please.
Very cool.
Just do that.
Awesome. Thank you.
When a book was recently published, The Bad and Good Girls of Hebrew Bible, or of Bible, I just about I did a Melissa McCarthy, Sean Spicer. I wanted to take a podium and like run around the room and say, stop that. You're just making these characters into these two-dimensional people, and they're not. They're so much richer. That doesn't mean, last thing about that before I get back to Ruth, that does not mean that in this society, women and children are not the most vulnerable groups. They are. If you've ever read the story about the Levite's concubine, which is horrific in the extreme and leads to a mass rape of 500 women from another tribe, effectively they're stolen, right? One of the things I tell my students is what happens in war. When war occurs, who are the most vulnerable populations? Women and children. We know that statistically. So guess what? Hebrew Bible doesn't say this is a good thing. It says this is what happens when your society is falling apart and when you go to war. To some extent, we could see that as a warning. Okay, back to Ruth, because we got to get back to her. So there's the words where Boaz says, this is actually on your page, right? May you have a full recompense from the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have sought refuge. The word there is kanaf, wings, God's wings. It's a beautiful image. Boaz says, you have sought refuge, and may God's wings come to cover you, to hold you. One of the most beautiful drashas that we have in Jewish tradition is of that beautiful text in Exodus where God says, I brought you out of Egypt on eagle's wings. A description of the people being cared for by an incredible, powerful bird. That just flies them into safety. It's so gorgeous. So here we have another similar image, God protecting Ruth with God's wings. So remember the word kanaf. That's really important. Question. You notice how Ruth says something to the effect, I think that's in here, she prostrates herself with her face to the ground. This isn't a little bow, thank you my Lord. She puts her face all the way on the ground. And she says to him something to the effect of, how are you being so nice to me when I am a foreigner? She names herself as a foreigner now. What's your interpretation there? How do you read that? What's she doing? I ask, does Ruth have an agenda? When she says, how can you be so nice to me? I'm just a foreigner. Any thoughts? Be brave.
Being manipulative.
I'm sorry?
Being manipulative.
You could read it that way. She absolutely is being manipulative. She's playing on his sympathy. She's going to use this moment for everything she's got. And doesn't she have to? Right? So you could see it both as manipulative and as manipulative because she hasn't got much choice. In that society, yes, she is dependent on the grace of a man in some place where she will find favor. Right? She can't make food willy-nilly out of nothing. She's going to be dependent. All right, so do the rest of you agree she's being manipulative? You're making a face. What's the face about? Not reading it that way.
I just feel like she's just looking for reassurance, like, you know, I'm a foreigner, just, I mean, it is manipulative, like, she wants him to tell her again, like, are you sure you're going to be, she's still scared, I would think.
What is your name?
Evelyn.
Evelyn. Evelyn? Your name is Evelyn? We need to talk after.
Oh gosh, I'm in trouble.
No, this is by way of nothing, but my mother-in-law, who was my Naomi, her name was Evelyn. So, yeah, I have an attachment to that name.
Is she just humiliating her, humbling herself as far as she can, I mean, her face to the ground?
Yes.
And calling herself the worst thing that this community can identify. She's
Is she humiliating herself?
humbling herself, maybe.
Humbling herself?
Isn't that also not fishing for a compliment, but it's an opportunity to take a step up? Because if he says no, then she's automatically gone from the bottom up a notch, which may help her in the future.
I cannot, yes, sir.
Rather than humbling herself, maybe she is very calculatingly showing her vulnerability to this powerful man as a way of saying that has an effect on me.
Theodore
That's a
Adorno,
coquettish
Yes.
type of behavior
maybe,
possible.
or Theodore Adorno's quote, I love, you know you are loved where you can show weakness without provoking strength. I cannot tell you how many times my beautiful, amazing, extraordinary, brilliant, funny, delightful daughter-in-law has thanked me for trying to understand the things that she does or thinks because she's Korean. Over and over again, I get that, right? And I say, Sarah, thank you for trying to understand me because I'm an Ashkenazi Jew, right? But she has grown up apologizing for who she is on a number of fronts because she's a foreigner, because she's an immigrant. So I actually see this playing out again in my own life, right? Yeah. So I'm a little bit with Evelyn here, right? She's showing vulnerability here. She's scared. But could you also say she knows exactly what she's doing? Well, let's look at chapter 3, shall we?
Well,
Right?
Didn't Boaz know how good she had been to Naomi?
Yes, he has said so. He has said, I've heard about you. And she's still doing this, right? But again, so is my daughter-in-law. When I tell her how wonderful she is, she still does this, right? I think it's going to take about 5 to 10 years before she feels safe enough not to have to do this anymore. Maybe sooner. I hope sooner. You know, but that she feels that vulnerability is a part of her very nature. It's a part of who she is. We have to think about that when we interact with people who've emigrated here, right? What is it that they think they have to apologize for? Why do they think they need to explain themselves to us? Mari, you're looking at me going, oh yeah.
Well, you do feel sometimes a little bit less. done. And it's, you know, it's something that I don't know why. But I moved in here when I was 17 from Panama. And, yeah, sometimes you feel like you have to prove yourself just a little bit more than
Yes.
you would otherwise. And I think people are just not aware maybe of
Yes.
cultures.
And we have statistical evidence that the children of immigrants actually overachieve on levels of it's extraordinary what they do. About 80% of a recent competition, national competition in various kinds of science fields that was open to high schoolers, 80% of the winners were immigrants. 80%, right? People overachieving to make up for the status problem all the time. That's a really interesting phenomenon we need to think about. So dangers of the dark. Here's a place where I have, and by the way, Emmy, how late can I go here? Because we're just getting...
22.
Okay, 22, good. You know, here's an interesting moment. Read Ruth 3:3. I gave you a different translation. It says, bathe, anoint yourself, dress up, go down to the threshing floor, but do not disclose yourself to the man until he has finished eating and drinking. Quite apart from the fact that Naomi is sending her Moabitess daughter-in-law, who's going to carry all the associations of over-sexualized foreign women from Moab, down to the most dangerous setting she can send her to, which is the threshing floor after men have been harvesting, after they're finishing a day of work, after they've drunk a lot and had a good time. Remember Judah, who after the harvest gets himself smashed and ends up with Tamar? Okay? So she's being sent down into a group of men in the middle of the night, in the dark, in a world, in an ancient world, where women out alone is generally not countenanced. Sound like anything you know? What was she doing out at the bar at 1 o'clock in the morning in that miniskirt? Okay, just saying. Asking for it, right? Could Ruth have been going down there, and could people have said later she was asking for it? Absolutely. Whatever might have happened to her. So she's sent down in this very dangerous place. But the very interesting thing about this is the Hebrew as written does not say, bathe, anoint yourself, and dress up and go down to the threshing floor. It is first person. I will put on your dress. I will go down to the threshing floor, and I will lay down, is what Naomi says. I just saw that, oh my God. The eyes just, like eyebrows went, what? Right? You never thought about that when you were reading the English, did you? That Naomi actually says, I'll do all these things. It's Ruth she's sending, but the verbs are first person singular. What is going on here? Yeah, Evelyn, you should look confused. We should all look confused. Because it's not like these writers don't know the difference between first person singular and second person singular. What do you think? How do you interpret that? What's going on?
Why did they change the translation?
Because translators are always trying to figure out how to make it least troublesome and most logical. It is actually Ruth who goes down. It's going to confuse the reader if we have we have Naomi saying these things in first person, so there must have been a mistake. We're just going to translate it as it probably should have been. This happens all the time. It happens in the story of Rahab. Go look at your English version of the story of Rahab, and it will say that she, was essentially hiding them in the English. Those two spies that Joshua sent in, that's not what the Hebrew says. Hebrew does not say she hid them. It says she hid him. And it uses a verb that is only used one other single time in Hebrew Bible, and it's used of one other woman who hides a male and saves all of Israel. Who is that? A woman who hides a male and saves Moses' mother Yocheved. Rahab is being compared by dint of using the same incorrect grammatical word to Yocheved, because those spies are going to save the Israelite project, right? She's really a mother in Israel, even though she's a foreigner and a prostitute, no less. Yeah, there's some tricky things that go go on in the Hebrew. Okay, so you've got a tricky thing right in front of you. What are you going to do with it? Any ideas? Yes, sir.
Did you have something you were
Not yet. He's trying to give it to you real quick here.
Well, so she sees Ruth as an extension of herself.
Uh-huh.
Ruth is a tool, an instrument at this point to achieve an objective.
At the
A means to an end.
Absolutely. At the beginning of this book, Naomi says, I'm too old to give you sons that you could wait for to perform the leveret. I, can't do this for you anymore. Is she, in effect, wishing that she herself could be the one to do this, knowing she can't? Is this projection on her case? I would do this, right? I can't. Yeah, I'm sending you instead. And is Ruth nothing but a womb with legs for Naomi? A means to an end. In which case, not very pretty, right? Naomi is sending her daughter-in-law, a woman she calls my daughter, into the most dangerous of settings, particularly for a Moabitess, to serve her needs. How do you react to that? Anybody want to defend Naomi here?
Well, I would say I think it's kind of ironic that this is not a powerful man using a woman as a means to an end, but it is a woman using a woman as a means to an end.
Excellent, and that's exactly why making the statement that women are always just traded around in Hebrew Bible doesn't work, because in some settings, it's women who have power over women. The power that Sarah has over Hagar is pretty scary, and the power Hagar tries to exercise over Sarah is pretty scary, right? I mean, there's tensions here, Rachel and Leah, we could go on. Sometimes women are the ones in control of how events are unfolding. Yes, ma'am?
But through this, don't we see the desperation? I mean, she doesn't have a lot more plays here.
I think you're quite right. At this point, Ruth has come home with a whole bunch of food, and now guess what? They've run out. Right? The harvest is over. Ruth has no place to go glean anymore. They're gonna go hungry. They got to do something. And that essentially promotes risk-taking. Another thing we find with immigrant populations is things that occur in risk-taking that are born out of desperation. You do not cross a desert risking your life and your limb unless you are desperate, people. You do not climb into a truck that might boil you alive unless you are desperate in some way. You don't take those risks if you're privileged with safety and security. You don't. None of us would. In sense, both of them are acting just as immigrants will have to act when they're put in a context where the community is not responding to them as human beings worthy of their care. That's what's happened here. This is a quintessential story for our times. We are the villagers. We are not Naomi and we are not Ruth. We're the villagers who got to see them come back and who have done absolutely nothing and who have put them in this kind of position. If the women had gathered around and said, hey, we need to make sure that Naomi and Ruth have some food, let's just as a community make sure they've got something to eat, would Naomi be doing this? If Boaz had said, oh, you know, my relative Elimelech's widow needs to be helped, would Naomi have been doing this? So that's the defense of Naomi that I think is quite legitimate. It doesn't look pretty, but if you look at the circumstances, you're going to have a different kind of feeling and compassion for both these women. Okay, so the dangers of the dark. Let's take a look at what actually happens. Ruth comes down. She's been instructed to find Boaz, lay down by his feet, uncover his feet, and then he's going to take over. Is that what happens? It's always bothered me a little bit that even Jewish Midrash immediately assumed that uncovering the feet here is a reference, and it could be, because feet are a euphemism for the male member in Hebrew Bible. It could be a statement that she essentially does something to seduce him. But there's something about that that's always bothered me. Because the text also says he wakes up and he's a little bit shocked to find her there. And in this rather gentlemanly way, he says, what the heck? There's a woman over here, right? And he does a lot of protective stuff in this text. And sometimes I think the way that we immediately read this as Moabite as acting sexual, maybe the author was telling us that's not what happens. Because I don't know about you, but if somebody uncovers my feet at night, I will wake up. Because my feet are cold. Sometimes the cigar just might be the cigar. But that's up to you. It's like I want to see this as that's the one place where I have a little trouble, assuming the worst in this character. So she goes down, he wakes up, who are you? And this is what she says in Ruth 3:9. Keep in mind, she's surrounded by a bunch of sleeping drunk men. She has to find him, remember? Naomi tells her. And she says, I am your handmaid Ruth. Spread your robe over your handmaid, for you are a redeeming kinsman. What is going on here? What is Ruth doing? You guys
flattering him.
Flattering him? Okay. She starts out by saying, I am your handmaid. In other words, I am your servant. Okay. Humbling herself at the get-go, that's the first thing that she does. Then she says, spread your robe over your handmaid. Guess what? The word she uses here is kanaf. Anybody remember what kanaf means? Wings. It also means the outer edge of a garment. Yes?
Oh, no, I'm just...
You're just doing that. Spread your wings over me. She uses Boaz's language for what God is supposed to do for her. Remember, Boaz said, may God spread God's protecting wings over you. And she essentially uses the same language, take your robe and essentially spread your wings or the edge of your garment over me. How do you interpret that? What do you think is going on? Yes?
The redeeming kinsman, isn't that a call to, you're not doing a Jewish law, you're supposed to have done this and you haven't?
She is naming him as having an official position towards her and towards Naomi. Yes, that's the second thing she does, right? Well, actually, third. So we start with, I am your handmaid. Then we have spread your wings over your handmaid. Then, because you are a redeeming kinsman, the act of spreading your robe over someone else is an act of commitment to marriage. She has just proposed marriage. Yes, she has. She has said, basically, I'm asking you to claim me in marriage. And then she says, for you are a redeeming kinsman. But a redeemer doesn't actually redeem in marriage. A redeemer is responsible for regaining land that is lost to the tribe, to the family, right? Or redeeming somebody out of slavery, right? Those are somewhat different operations that the redemption law is meant to include. You're supposed to redeem your firstborn son in Pidyon Haben so that your firstborn son will not be, forcibly put in temple service. I never did this because I didn't know about that law when my son was born, and my son argues, yes, and did I do temple service? I sure did, Mom. His whole life was spent in temple service. So here we have her putting together law of redemption and marriage in one fell swoop. Where did she get the idea that he was a redeeming kinsman? Who told her that? Naomi. So she's picked up that. And why does she think marriage? Who's been sort of hinting around that she has to find a husband in order to be safe? Naomi, right? But did Naomi actually physically, intellectually, verbally put these things together? Who does that first time in this book? It's Ruth. Who does that? She was supposed to wait for Boaz to do that. What do you think about the fact that she doesn't? She doesn't wait for him to figure it out, to put all these things together. He's a little slow on the uptake, apparently. Who is this woman at my feet? Oh, for God's sake, come on, figure it out, right? So why is it Ruth who does this, and what are we supposed to understand as a result? What's the author telling us about Ruth? How do we see her actions?
She's desperate.
Okay, she's desperate enough to marry an old dude who has a lot of money, right? And he himself says, you know, you're valued because you could have been running after those younger dudes, right? That's a whole nother picture. We can get into that thing. You know, she's flattering an older man. She's desperate.
Isn't she also taking action because she's going to be the ancestor of David? Does that play into
Yeah.
this?
Does she know that at this moment? I don't think so. But does the author know that? Yes. Yes. Is this book absolutely a way to justify the fact that David has Moabite ancestors? Yes. Right? There are other places in the Bible where he actually goes to Moab. So that's a thing. There's a polemic. There's an agenda here. Sure. Anything else? Any other thoughts about who she is and what she's doing? Why she's not waiting for the man to make the decision? And this again is that place where, hey, you know, if it's all about women being traded, she should have waited. She should have waited for Boaz to make, you know, to do what Naomi said he was going to do. Make all the decisions, do all the work. No, she just goes right at it. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, so maybe there, and I know nothing about Jewish law, but maybe there was another option. Maybe there was the option that he could take her into the home as a servant or something like that. And maybe she's just going for broke. You know, it's an all or nothing proposition for her. Maybe she's not willing to take that, or she sees that maybe there are two options here, and she just goes for it.
Possible. Very possible. Yes, sir.
Well, I mean, isn't it clear? I mean, they're running out of food. This is an act of desperation. She can't wait for something to happen. She has to make it happen.
And so she doesn't even wait to see what Boaz is going to offer. She's going to put out on the table what she wants and see how he responds. Right?
Naomi told her to do it.
Though Naomi also told her to wait for Boaz to make he will tell you what to do, Naomi says. Ruth changes that game plan. Yes.
Yeah, well, Naomi tells her, go and he'll tell you what to do. And I think Naomi is seeing, okay, we're going to keep ending up starving if we do this piecemeal. You know, if I just keep saving my ass one little day at a time, this isn't going to work out. And so she's not going to just let herself be an easy piece. She is, like you said, just going to lay it all out there and ask for what she wants. And I think this isn't just desperation. This is foxy. You know, this is smart like a fox. The two of them are really, I think, consciously, or maybe unconsciously, but somehow or other, they are pooling their resources.
Yeah.
And her youth and beauty is a resource.
How old is she? How old is Ruth?
Yeah, we talked about this last week. It's likely if she married Machlon, she might have been between 12 and 15. They lived together about 10 years. So she's a young woman of between about 23 and 26. So, you know, yes, Marty?
So is she being manipulative also?
Possibly.
Like her mother wanted?
Possibly. Right?
Sounds like it.
Is there a manipulation going on, right, in a vulnerable, in the dark moment? And it certainly does succeed, though Boaz also says there's another redeeming kinsman. Essentially, we have to make sure, you know, because Boaz is always like about making sure things go right. We have to make sure that that redeeming kinsman isn't going to step in, and if he doesn't, then fine. Then we're on, honey. We can do this. And he calls her an Eshet Chayil, a woman of valor, right, a woman of virtue, a woman of strength, and sends her on her way. And then there's an amazing moment where essentially she comes home and her mother-in-law says, not how is it with you, daughter, she really says, who are you, my daughter? Mi at bati. Who are you? Right, which is a very different question from Naomi. Not how did it go, but who are you now? Has something changed about who you are? And, you know, we've got this, again, sort of reiteration. I shouldn't go home empty-handed, right? I'm here because Boaz cares about you too, right? All of this. So, you know, when you're concluding and thinking about this, manipulation, you might say, or smart like a fox, or desperate, absolutely desperate. I'd like you to think about the way that we tend to judge the actions of immigrants and the way some of the words desperate or manipulative come out of our mouths, because we're not on the other side, right? We don't know what it is to be a child who was brought to this country, who finds out somewhere between 12 and 18 that they're not here documented, whose every dream gets smashed and destroyed about what they're going to do with their life, how they're going to go to college, how they're going to make a career, anything like that. Children who were believing that they were part of this community, believing that they were Americans, and then what is it that they have to do to make sure that they're not going to be deported? Well, some of them are paying $40,000 to $50,000. They are, some of them, to get someone to marry them, right? Which is, that's selling yourself. And we may judge that as really, you know, underhanded, but isn't Ruth, in essence, doing something like that? And do we condemn Ruth? We understand her. Maybe applying the same compassion to those people who are in our very society suffering in exactly the same ways with the same kind of desperation would be a useful idea. And I will just close with, did anybody of you listen to NPR on the way in today to this session? There was a whole little piece about the fact that we are an aging population that's going to need more and more medical care, and we are not as fertile as we once were. And we actually need immigration so that our generation will be taken care of when we get to the point of being in nursing homes, when we are at the point of being in hospitals much more often than any of us would like, right? There are all sorts of stuff around, you know what, actually that population could help sustain us. Ruth becomes the grandmother of David. I think she's an example for us. Next week what we'll look at is how it is that they, the three of them, Naomi, Ruth, and Boaz, construct a creative reimagining of Jewish law and get the community to buy in. Okay? I will, oh yes, question?
Does Boaz have a wife?
No, he is a single dude.
But could he have more than one?
If he had wanted to, yes. According to Israelite law, yeah. Polygamy is actually one of the reasons why adultery in Hebrew Bible is described only as having relationships with a married woman, right? For a man, or a woman having a relationship with a, yeah, it's you have to get around that fact that men are allowed to have more than one wife. That changes in the Middle Ages, thankfully, for women.
But it was really unusual that he was unmarried.
Yes, it is very unusual that he was unmarried. So it's something for us to think about too, right? Is the author trying to tell us something? But I think you are all ready to leave and go to enjoy your Sabbath. So I'm going to wish you a wonderful Sabbath, and I'll see you next week. Oh, yes, I will be happy to bless you. So last week, I'm forgetting what I blessed you with last week, but last week turned out to be a week of complete madness on so many fronts. I would like to bless you all with the awareness that you are not helpless, though you are living in challenging times. You are not helpless to give. You are not helpless to help. You are not helpless to act. And that you yourselves be reminded by the Holy One of Blessing, that you are godding in this world, that what you do with your hands, and what you say with your lips, and what you write with your computers, all of those things, where you stand, where you move, where you act, can be an extension of God's grace in this world. May it be so. Amen.